Suppose we get back on the main track now, after having taken a stopover while I aired my views, and consider some more of the miracles and marvels of nature and plant life. Miracles and marvels that, after all, have sound reasons underlying them and simple explanations behind them, if we will look carefully enough, and from all of which we can draw lessons that help in our understanding of human problems. There was considerable made back in 1908 and 1910 about a stoneless plum I was working on. Horticulturalists and scientists said it was impossible. Newspapermen, looking around for something novel and interesting to write about, made up stories about it as another proof that I was a wizard of plant life. I tried for a while to deny the wizardry part of the narrative, but no newspaperman wants a good story spoiled, and the magic of the stoneless plum received a lot more attention than the homely truth. The fact is that the stoneless plum came from a cutting sent me by one of my volunteer collectors in France. He had taken it from a very old tree, and he was not able to account for the fact that the fruit had no stone, or none to speak of. He merely sent it along for what it was worth. I don't suppose there was another such tree in existence, and it would be difficult to account exactly for it. It may have been a variation, a mutation, caught by some old chap who was curious about it and grafted into one of his plum trees, or it may have been a seedling that had forgotten to provide material for its stone and had developed into a freak of nature. I seized on it at once as having possibilities for the development of a new, stoneless variety of plums, and I worked with it for years. It was the beginning of a stoneless plum and a stoneless prune, which I have. They are not yet entirely satisfactory, but in time they will become so, if they are intelligently crossbred with established and valuable varieties, and if selection is made that will weed out all the seedlings that show undesirable traits and will preserve and foster those that lean or tend toward desirable ones. It is the process to which I have referred so often, the mingling of heredities to break up uniformity and accustomed habits of growth and fruiting, and to cause the appearance of a large number of variations. Then the careful selection as between these several variations that will eventuate in time in a clean-cut, fixed variety having the characteristics desired, in this case, size, flavor, sturdiness of growth, productivity, and fine quality, all coupled with the entirely new characteristic of stonelessness. So much is simple, but not so simple as the solution of the question, whence came the first stoneless plum on some hillside in France? One scientific school would call it a mutation, an accidental and sudden variation with no known or traceable cause. Another would maintain that there is no such thing as a sudden mutation, but that the heredity of the plant somewhere contained the stoneless quality, and that it finally cropped out in this plum. I'm convinced that both are partially right. My experience leads me to believe that small, gradual, persistent variations occur in plants as they do in animals and in man, and also I believe that these slight variations, impressed on the heredity of the plant, may become submerged and lie for untold generations in the seed without developing until, without any reason I can definitely state, but under some such environmental influence as soil, climate, moisture, or the presence of a food value exactly suited to the demands of that seedling trait in the seed, the old, dormant trait springs to life in a single individual plant, and we are startled to find a stoneless plum tree. There are similar occurrences in the human family. What is it causes this young man, soberly bred, well-educated, of a refined and cultivated family, suddenly to turn thief or murderer or rascal? You may look back through 5 or 6 or 8 generations and find no trace of any such tendency as is manifest in him. Yet somewhere along the line, perhaps farther back than you can go, with your incomplete records, you will find a strain of criminality or a tendency toward a moral outbreak. Given that taint, no matter how remote, you have only to put the mother of the unborn child or the infant himself into an environment that gives the old, sinister trait encouragement, or you have only to put the boy some pressure, mental or physical, such as worry or overindulgence or a bad illness, and abruptly the weakness comes to the surface, and there is a job for the police department or the insane asylum or the penitentiary. It has taken us a long time to realize that criminal tendencies or mental deficiencies are not often the fruits of lax training or of individual perversions. Society and the law used to sit back complacently until the wayward boy actually stole a ham or the weak-minded woman actually set fire to her house or tore up all her clothing, and then the officers would come along and clap the offender into a jail or an asylum. Now we can see, and nature herself has taught us the truth, that the weakling and the perverse and the feeble-minded must be given a proper environment early, and their stronger and better talents and traits and tendencies accented and brought out, so that perhaps the bad characteristics will be submerged or drowned out of the unfortunate. Often it is found that the heredity is too strong for the environment. The taint has permeated the whole system, and no care or love or kindness or education will conquer it. I have often been asked what prescription I would give in such a case. I can only answer that in my gardens, dangerous weeds are uprooted and destroyed. Weak plants are removed, and no tainted individual is permitted to bear seed, or even to develop pollen, lest an entire field be affected and the strong, the good, and the beautiful be cursed with the evil influence of one depraved individual. Nature hires no criminal lawyers and issues no writs of habeas corpus for the vicious or weak plants. I never heard of her letting out a mad dog on probation. Perhaps her way with plants and animals is not as good a way as man's with man, but it would require a long session and some eloquent arguments to convince me of that fact. There is no branch of human life or activity for which you cannot find some analogy in the garden or field, and, if you examine the matter closely enough, none about which you cannot learn a good deal to your advantage from studying nature's methods, laws, and processes. The subordination of the individual to the race, and nature's habit with hereditary taints and traits, are no more striking than her strong prejudice, as I believe, in favor of individuality in plant or animal. What seems a paradox at first view is really consistent with her whole scheme. Let us examine this interesting fact more closely. All plants have a strong individuality, sometimes only apparent from close scrutiny, and others that your own dog could see. The individual traits of varieties and species, taken as a whole, are the most noticeable. Consider desert growth, in which I first became interested when I began my work 30 years ago with the cactus. The outstanding characteristic of our deserts is lack of moisture. The plant, to persist in the arid wastes, has first to conserve moisture and store every available drop of water it could lay root or leaf on. It becomes sparse, wiry, and deep-rooted in the sagebrush and saltweed, for example, or, as in the cactus, it developed big, tough-skinned reservoirs in its leaves. But having conquered death from drought, it found itself by the very fact exposed to a new danger, the danger of destruction by animals forced, because the desert growth was sparse, to turn for food to the few varieties that had survived the rigors of the climate. So here was a new enemy to defeat, and the desert plants put out their energies in battle and eventually were so dry and bitter and tough that no animal, not even a burro, would get much satisfaction out of them, or else they put out spines to make themselves about as poor an article of diet as you could find anywhere. That is individuality, variation in the species, called forth by environment and entering into the heredity of the plant so that it will breed true, finally, as long as its surrounding conditions remain unchanged. But the same power to vary runs through the whole of plant life and down to individuals of the same species. As there are no two men exactly alike, so there are no two roses or lilies or redwood trees exactly the same. Partly, this individuality inside families of plants is due to differences, often minute, in environment. More shade or less moisture, a variation in the soil, or whatnot, but mainly it is due to nature's insistence on variation. Because from variation she gets the adaptability in the plant which enables it to resist enemies or make friends, and so to preserve life and ensure the perpetuation of the species, come what may, in the way of change of locality, change of climate, visitations of disease or of destructive animals, and so on. Nature favors this variability, I say. I believe she favors it in man, and that, to her, the genius, the creative spirit, the originator, the inventor, the daring thinker, the pioneer and explorer, whether in finding new lands and charting strange seas, or in marching ahead in scientific fields and breaking away from orthodox beliefs, are all expressions of her desire for progress. There is no more interesting example of the parallel between nature's process in plant life and in human life than is to be found in our own America. In this great garden, she has cross-pollinated races and tribes and the people of every nation. The result has been a wholesale production of hybrid seedlings presenting every conceivable phase of variation. Some of these crosses have turned out badly, and society has selected out the worst of them and discarded them. Others that are none too useful are still growing like weeds. But from the whole bed have sprung such new and striking and useful individual plants as Henry Ford, Theodore Roosevelt, Jacob Riis, Joseph Pulitzer, and hundreds more. In fact, there are very few Americans whose recent ancestors have not brought to the family some blood of a people other than English. We are crosses within the last few generations from every nation under the sun, and our variations have produced wide differences in capacity and ability, and a very bouquet of geniuses and original thinkers. Now observe how the apparent paradox of nature's emphasis of race importance and her prejudice in favor of individual differences and individual superiorities merges into a simple statement of the same law in two forms. The superior individual contributes more to the welfare of the race than the ordinary or the subnormal individual. Each genius, or leader, or creative artist helps to make his fellows more adaptable and better fitted to carry on the struggle of life. Just as in the plant world, variation is necessary to adaptability, and adaptability is essential to the conquest of the changing conditions of the world and to the overcoming of adverse environment or the seizing of the advantages of a favorable environment. Nature seems to be full of exceptions to every rule, but on analysis we find that the underlying law is immutable and the underlying principle changeless and infallible. Let us go into a swamp or a crowded and neglected garden for another lesson from the plant world that is applicable to our own problems and that may have a moral for us who consider ourselves so superior to the lower orders of life. In the swamp, there is a rich accumulation of plant foods. There is heat, there is water. The growth is tangled, dense, luxuriant, and usually partly poisonous. In the neglected garden, everything has run riot, and weeds and flowers elbow and push, and pant and struggle to maintain life. An overcrowded city of inferior individuals, all seeking room and breathing space and a place in the sun. How like a crowded city, the swamp like the slums, the neglected garden like the business section or the apartment house district. In the swamp, the tendency is steadily toward rank growth. To be sure, the swamp may produce orchids, the most beautiful and fragile and delicate bloom known. I remember once being asked if I had ever done any work to improve orchids. I stared at the questioner for a moment or two, fumbling for a reply, and then I said, perhaps a little impatiently, "Improve orchids? But who on earth would dream of wanting them improved?" Well, the orchid is a development of tropical jungle growth. Beautiful. It is the rich, effulgent product of an environment that has in it many elements of disease and destruction. Our slums are like that, breeding crime and disease, overcrowded, producing unfortunates and unfit, and yet occasionally giving us a great musician, a great actress, or a great merchant, because the densely populated area has good blood and good heredity here and there in it, and because the conditions are exotic and the strong individuals produce strong mentalities, strengthened and enriched by the very force of the pressure about them. Neither the jungle nor the slum is desirable, and someday we will do away with both, as we are gradually doing away with our own swamps in the South. Until that time comes, we must be content with the occasional orchid of genius who is the fruit of that environment. The crowding of our cities is like the crowding of a neglected garden, and there is where spindling, weak, attenuated growth occurs, and where the average of strength, bodily and mental, is lowered by the struggle and the pressing in of a multitude of weeds. The growth of cities is unhealthy for a nation, but I seem to see a tendency to spread out into suburbs and outlying districts that may solve a problem that has caused disaster in past history. Our task is to go into that neglected garden and, by pruning, weeding, opening up breathing spaces such as parks and playgrounds, and giving the human plants such environmental advantages as education and training to enable them to meet the competition of the crowd and reach a fuller stature mentally and physically. Plants must have elbow room, and when we give it to them, they improve and grow strong. When a man is crowded down to a bare subsistence and pushed upon all sides by necessity, by competition, by economic demands, he has little chance for growth. He cannot even grow up to the measure of his possibilities. He becomes more and more like all his fellows. There is no chance for variation. That is as clear as daylight. And without variation, there is no progress. And without progress, there soon begins to be retrogression. Let us turn to another of the laws governing the development of variations and variant types in the plant world that has an important bearing on our knowledge of the training and development of the human plant. I have written a good deal about inducing new characteristics in flowers, fruits, and trees, but I have not yet gone much into the relative difficulties presented by the hereditary strains in those plants. The California poppy, I have said, lent itself to manipulation very readily, and that was because it was in a transitional stage from some earlier form of ancestry, and none of its qualities were firmly fixed. On the other hand, the cactus was a hard nut to crack. These two examples will serve well to bring out the point I have in mind. A change in the nature of a plant, as in the nature of a human being, must take into account the length of time the heredity has been unchanged in the particular you are deriving at. You can bend a plant toward a change in color, let us say, without much trouble, but you would have considerable difficulty in developing a change in root structure, number of petals, or in leaf form. That is because the color was added after all the other characteristics of the plant. It is a more modern improvement, whereas the whole life history of the plant may have seen very little change in its form and structure. The poppy had no old, fixed, stubborn heredity. Therefore, it could be led to grow tall, or dwarfed, golden or yellow or red, and with large or small blossoms, almost with no effort at all. The cactus, fighting for existence for hundreds or thousands of generations, had its characteristics deeply rooted and with few variations from the normal. In the cactus, I wanted two important improvements: a more luxuriant growth and the elimination of the dangerous spines. The usual desert cactus is covered with a pincushions full of the sharpest and most active little spines. It is almost impossible to put a finger on the plant without getting scores or hundreds of those tiny stings into your flesh. Once there, you cannot brush them out or even pick them out without the greatest difficulty. I had a man working for me about 14 years ago who got a cactus spine in the end of his finger and who never has succeeded in getting it out, so that there is to this day a tiny discolored spot under his nail where that obstinate cactus spine has settled down for its old age. Of course, this meant that the cactus, which except for the spines would make succulent and heavily productive food for cattle, was valueless, and my desire was to take off the spines, develop a great productivity of slabs or leaves, and render our American deserts in semi-arid sections useful to cattlemen. But I had lighted on a habit of the cactus that was almost as old as the plant itself. One of its first developments had been this protective armor against foraging beasts. The work was slow, and the setbacks numerous. That I succeeded in the end was due to persistent selection, repetition of the same characteristics in the chosen plants, and the destruction in enormous and expensive quantities of all the rest. It was like teaching a dog by telling him the same thing over and over and over again, always in the same tone of voice and with the same gestures and wording, until he accommodates himself to a new habit and responds to your will. In the end, I exceeded in fixing the spineless quality in my cactus. As long as the plants are grown from slabs, the leaves that result will be a cactus free from spines. But even the spineless variety will produce variations when grown from the seeds, so that the cactus seedlings cannot be relied on. This is because the spineless characteristic, or habit, is the last one added to the cactus, and it will take scores or hundreds of generations, perhaps, to make the plant forget all about spines when it comes to the instinctive manufacture of its seeds, and come permanently and invariably true. Here is a marvelous truth for human beings in their own problems, especially the problems of education. You cannot breed out nor educate out the oldest traits of men easily, but you can succeed almost any given line, provided you stick to that line and persist and are patient and intelligent. Selfishness and greed and hate are old human characteristics. The love of music and dancing and drama are newer, relatively speaking. Therefore, when you begin to work with a child, you can accomplish wonders in awakening in him an appreciation of music or art, or even in inducing in him some talent along aesthetic lines. But when you start to eradicate the older traits, you find yourself bucking the heredity of 100,000 years, maybe. And you must not expect to transform a fighting boy or a liar or a glutton overnight. It will probably take 20 years to make even a faint impress on him. And if you want to get permanent results that he will pass on to his children, you had better make up your mind to use up 10 or 15 generations on the job. We have been attempting to educate the American Indian and Christianize him, to break up mafia among Italian immigrants, to stop Tong wars among the Chinese, and to elevate the whole Negro race from slavery to a high type of citizenship. With individuals, we have made progress. The variations in those people have been wide enough to give us certain latitude and make possible certain gains. But taken as a whole, we have not established any records. We have succeeded in putting a few Tong murderers and Black Hand criminals to death, in filling the Negro full of wrong notions, and in getting the Indian to the place where he will attend Sunday school along about Christian's time, just before the annual barrels of old clothes and worn-out toys come to the missionaries from Eastern friends or supporters. Every one of those four types has inherent in it fine possibilities, and we have gone at the job largely from the wrong end. We have passed laws and put on policemen to enforce them, but we haven't taken hold of the more recently acquired hereditary characteristics of each one and worked back from those slowly and patiently toward the underlying and motivating heritages and inherited tendencies. Back of all life is a common law. It is not by studying the child or the seaweed or the rose or the star or the dog alone that we come to that law, but by studying all of nature and learning to harmonize our facts and erect a balanced structure of truth. At times, we come on contradictions, paradoxes, enigmas, and we become discouraged and pessimistic and baffled. It seems, often, that there is no scheme of things, but that what we call nature is only a blind, fatuous, endless struggle between two forces, positive and negative, constructive and destructive, the upward pull and the downward drag. Scientists, thinkers, philosophers all have their dark moments, and some of them come only to box canyons from which, in the end, they can see no escape, and in which they perish, proclaiming that life is a meaningless and abortive chaos. But if we will catch and hold every single ray of light that shines through, and if all the rays are focused by science and philosophy and education, the brilliance of the real truth will persist and grow and spread until its light will illuminate all the dark pages of the book of life, and every line and precept will be clear to read and simple to understand.